And the box, he would later find out, was Atlantean, so older than the Stone Age. But in the meanwhile, around this time, Uncle Andrew had been continuing to learn more about magic. And it's implied that this is a dark kind of thing. That's implied by certain lines. Uncle Andrew says it wouldn't be proper to explain such and such to a child. He says that his pursuit included some, quote, very disagreeable experiences, etc. So Uncle Andrew's continued pursuit of magic during that time period is another characteristic of Uncle Andrew's questionable moral character, which he inherited from Mrs. LeFay. And this is the case even though the kind of magic discussed in this story is never equated with, let's say, the demonic or the spiritual. It seems that Lewis has created a fairly unique space in this book for non-Narnian magic, in which magicians are people who are tampering with things they don't understand and generally doing immoral or inappropriate things in order to do so, even though the result is somewhat like the standard fairy tale kind of magic, in which magic equals a set of laws of nature associated with fantasy and myth. I think Lewis probably did this, maybe partly because he was aware of the possible dissonance that comes from combining fairy tale magic with a real world type of context. This is the opposite, I think, to what was done in the first Harry Potter book. In that book, Rowling equated Hogwarts magic with the historical concept of witchcraft and suggested this is why magical persons in the Harry Potter universe need to try to hide from non-magical society. I'm guessing Rowling probably did this in order to try to position her fantasy narrative in opposition to tragic moments of history such as the Salem witch trials. Maybe she was influenced as well by the Satanic Panic, which ran through the 80s and 90s. The first Harry Potter book was 1998. So it wouldn't surprise me if maybe that was even a trend at the time to make witches the heroes, just to stand against the uh, really tragically false accusations that only came to light gradually through time. But the unfortunate result of this, from a Christian point of view, is that stories like Harry Potter Book One seem to make an ambiguous suggestion that if there were such a thing as witchcraft or occult power, then it would probably be a good thing. I think C.S. Lewis, writing 40 years before that, was doing something similar, but coming from a carefully Christian point of view. He also recognizes the potential there is for ambiguity between fairy tale magic and ideas of occult spiritual power within the real world. And particularly, he realizes that because this story is set in London, in contrast to his other stories, which are in Narnia. So he frames his colorful pixie dust magic as something that cannot be pursued in rural London without questionable means. Those who pursue fairy tale magic outside of the magical land of Narnia do so as interlopers who are dabbling in things they don't understand, who are stepping outside the bounds of what is healthy for them and outside of what is right and healthy and good to experiment with. And this is the case even though the kind of colorful fantasy magic contained in the Narnia stories, as well as with the Harry Potter stories, could never be confused with anything reflecting real life beliefs or practices of any past or present group. Magic within fairy tale universes tends to have, and that is the case with these stories, tends to have less in common with some kind of practice and more in common with just the instinctive play acting of children. This is the way Jerram Bars from Covenant Seminary frames it, is the idea that the kind of magical thinking that tends to characterize make-believe play in children of any kind, the kind of thing that happens when somebody without any external influence just spontaneously imagines that daddy's scarecrow out in the fields can actually talk, or that your stuffed bear ought to actually be able to walk and talk and give you a hug. That kind of use of the word magic has nothing to do with any culture's spirituality, whether of the accepted variety or of the taboo, more occult variety. It has nothing to do with those. It simply emerged from imagination and creativity and a spirit of play. And I think that's the kind of magic really that we're talking about here. Anyway, so we recognize that the concept of magic in Narnia has always been of the purely fantasy or fairy tale variety, in which we simply imagine for the fun of it that there are magical laws of nature that we know there actually aren't, almost like a pretend subcategory of science. But in this book, for somebody to tap into those imaginary magical principles in the context of, let's say, London, requires some presumptuous and destructive interloping into things you don't understand, and requires learning from shady characters who don't understand the very things they're sharing with you. And through these kinds of dabbling pursuits, Uncle Andrew finally discovered that what that mysterious box contained was actually dust from another world. Uncle Andrew says, I knew that if only you could get it into the right form, the dust would draw you back to the place it had come from. And then, with much experimentation, finally